It began on a quiet Saturday morning in the outskirts of a suburban neighborhood known for its manicured lawns, matching mailboxes, and self-appointed enforcers of peace and order. The place was ruled by the local HOA, but even beyond that, there existed a silent hierarchy among its residents. Some minded their own business, while others, the Karens, believed they were born to manage everyone else's. When I moved into that neighborhood 6 months ago, I didn't think my hobby would stir any kind of attention. Falconry wasn't something you saw every day, but my property was just on the edge of the HOA line, bordering a stretch of open field that rolled into the countryside. It was the perfect place for my falcon, Nira, to stretch her wings. Nira wasn't just a pet. She was a trained predator, sharp-eyed and elegant. Every morning she would take off from her perch and soar over the golden grass, scanning for movement, learning the air currents, and circling the sky with quiet command. The sight of her flying against the sun was breathtaking, unless, of course, you were the type of person who thought every bird was a threat to your peace. That's how Karen entered the picture. Her house stood 2 lots over, easily recognized by the overgrown flower beds and the security cameras aimed at every possible angle. She was the sort of neighbor who watched everyone else's business, but believed her own actions were beyond reproach. She had already filed complaints about excessive noise from children laughing, about unauthorized colors of mailboxes, and even about a teenager's parked car, disturbing the uniformity of the street. So it wasn't surprising when she decided that my falcon was the next great menace to civilization. It started with glares. Whenever Nira flew above the houses, I'd catch Karen standing on her porch, squinting up at the sky like she was personally offended by the laws of nature. Then came the muttering, short bursts of anger that carried across the yard. The neighbors whispered that she had already called the HOA about it, demanding action against the flying threat. Of course, the HOA did what they always did, nothing of value. They sent a politely worded letter reminding me of the community commitment to harmonious living and asked that I ensure all pets are adequately restrained. I laughed when I read it. You don't restrain a falcon. You respect it. But Karen wasn't done. The following weekend, I was out in the open field behind my property, watching Nira circle high above, her wings cutting through the morning light. The air was calm, the kind that carried sound easily. And that's when I heard her voice for the first time, shrill, commanding, and filled with misplaced authority. She stood at the edge of my yard, arms crossed, visor tilted forward, and phone in hand, recording as if she had discovered a crime scene. She was shouting about safety, property lines, and how wild animals didn't belong in civilized neighborhoods. But Nira didn't care about her words. She was too far above to hear any of it, gliding freely in her element. Karen, however, decided to escalate. She stomped closer, waving her phone like a badge of power, yelling something about calling animal control and reporting me to the HOA board. Her voice grew louder, echoing through the open space. And that's when Nira noticed her. The falcon shifted midair, her sharp eyes narrowing on the movement below. To Nira, Karen's waving arms must have looked like the signal of prey or threat. It was instinct, pure and primal. With a sudden fold of her wings, she dived. The sound of her descent cut through the silence like a blade. Wind rushed. Feathers sliced the air. Karen's yelling stopped abruptly as she looked up and saw a streak of motion coming straight for her. Nira didn't touch her, of course. She wasn't trained for aggression. But the speed of that dive, the shriek of the falcon's cry, and the sheer force of her presence were enough to freeze any human in their tracks. Karen's phone fell from her hand as she stumbled backward, shrieking louder than Nira herself. The falcon pulled up at the last moment, wings wide, catching the air and rising again. But Karen was already running, sprinting toward her house like she had seen a ghost. She disappeared behind her front door, slamming it shut so hard that it echoed down the block. The field went quiet again. Nira circled once more, calm and majestic, before landing gracefully on her perch. From that day forward, Karen didn't come outside for a while. Her blinds stayed closed, and her porch remained empty. But that didn't mean she had let the matter go. In neighborhoods like this, grudges didn't fade. They just grew quiet until the next meeting, the next letter, the next confrontation. And sure enough, a few days later, I saw the first signs of the storm brewing. A notice from the HOA arrived, an official summons to a special hearing regarding animal endangerment and public safety. Someone had filed a complaint claiming a large predatory bird had attacked a resident. It didn't take a genius to know who filed it. Still, I wasn't worried. I had footage from my own cameras, proof that no attack had occurred. But HOA hearings weren't about fairness. They were about appearances, about who could talk the longest and make the loudest case. And if there was one thing Karen excelled at, it was being loud. As I read through the notice, I couldn't help but laugh quietly to myself. Nira sat beside me, preening her feathers, calm as ever. She didn't understand that she had just become the center of a suburban scandal. The sky outside darkened as evening settled in, and I watched her tilt her head toward the fading light, restless, as if she could sense that something new was coming. Karen wasn't finished, and neither was I. The neighborhood might have been her domain before, but soon enough, she would learn that not everything could be controlled. Because while she ruled the cul-de-sac, the sky was mine, and Nira was watching. The letter from the HOA wasn't a surprise. It was a performance waiting to happen. Karen had finally found an audience for her outrage, and the board was more than willing to lend her their attention. The special hearing was set for Saturday morning in the community clubhouse, a beige brick building that smelled faintly of old coffee and fresh paint. The notice listed me as the accused party, which made me laugh out loud. They phrased it like some kind of legal proceeding, full of phrases like public safety concern, neighborhood reputation, and appropriate disciplinary actions. In reality, it was nothing more than a gossip session with paperwork. Still, I decided to go. It wasn't about defending myself. It was about setting the record straight. When Saturday came, the parking lot was already half full. HOA hearings had a strange pull in this neighborhood. They weren't just meetings, they were entertainment. People who usually never spoke to one another gathered, curious to see who would be shamed this time. I could feel their eyes on me as I walked in, some sympathetic, others quietly judgmental. Inside, the board sat in their usual formation, 5 members behind a long table, stacks of folders in front of them like shields. At the center sat Linda, the president, a woman with the posture of a judge and the warmth of a granite countertop. To her right sat Mark, who treated every HOA issue like it was a national emergency. And to her left, Karen. Apparently she wasn't just a complainer. She was a board member. That explained a lot. She didn't look at me when I entered. Her eyes were fixed on the papers in front of her, lips pressed tight, like she'd been rehearsing her outrage all morning. A few residents filled the chairs behind me, whispering to one another. Someone even had their phone out, probably ready to record the spectacle. Linda cleared her throat and began the meeting in her usual monotone. This session concerns a safety complaint filed by board member Karen regarding a resident's animal, specifically a bird of prey allegedly endangering the community. It was the word allegedly that gave me some hope, but not much. Karen took her chance immediately. She stood up, papers trembling slightly in her hand, not from fear but from the adrenaline of righteous fury. She described the incident in vivid detail, painting herself as the victim of an unprovoked attack. She claimed the Falcon had targeted her, that it swooped aggressively and nearly made contact. Her voice grew louder with every sentence until it echoed off the walls. Then she started waving her phone, footage from her recording that day. But as soon as it played, the dramatic energy in the room began to fade. The video showed her yelling, waving her arms, stepping onto my property, and then screaming as a blur of feathers passed several feet above her. There was no contact. No attack, just panic. The board members exchanged awkward looks. I waited for her to finish before standing. "As you can see," I said evenly, "my bird never touched her. Falcons dive like that all the time. It's how they fly, not how they attack." She startled Nira by shouting and waving her arms. "That's all," Karen interrupted, voice trembling with anger. "That thing is dangerous. It shouldn't be here. What if it attacks a child next time?" Linda raised a hand to quiet her. "Please, Karen, let him finish." I explained the legal side, that falconry was licensed, regulated, and fully permitted. I even brought documentation, training certifications, permits, and state wildlife approvals. I'd done everything by the book. When I laid the folder on the table, Linda flipped through it silently. For a moment, the room was quiet except for the rustle of papers. Then Mark leaned forward, looking at me like he was solving a crime. "Even if it's legal," he said, "shouldn't there be some consideration for how it makes neighbors feel?" There it was, the core of HOA logic. Feelings over facts. Comfort over common sense. Karen jumped in, sensing the opening. "Exactly. It's not about legality. It's about community safety. We can't have wild predators flying over our homes." Her words got nods from a few residents. Others just looked uncomfortable, unsure which side to pick. Linda sighed. "The board will deliberate and issue a decision within 7 days," she said. "In the meantime, we ask that the resident refrain from flying the bird over the neighborhood." It wasn't a punishment, but it was still a restriction. I nodded quietly, even though I could feel Karen's smug satisfaction radiating from across the room. The meeting adjourned, and people began to leave in clusters, whispering. Karen lingered behind, pretending to organize her papers, but clearly waiting for the chance to gloat. I ignored her and walked out into the sunlight, where the open sky stretched endlessly above. For the next week, I kept Naira grounded. She perched by the window, restless and alert, watching the sky she couldn't touch. Every time I looked at her, I felt a pang of frustration. She didn't understand why she was grounded for doing nothing wrong. But I knew Karen wasn't finished. A few days later, I started noticing small things, anonymous complaints in my mailbox about noise, about animal waste, even about unauthorized fencing. Someone had taken the time to document every minor imperfection on my property. It was petty warfare, the kind waged in whispers and paperwork. Then came the drone. I noticed it one afternoon while cleaning Naira's perch. A small black drone hovered above my yard, camera blinking. At first, I thought it belonged to some kid down the block. But when it drifted lower, I saw it, Karen's initials on the side, written in permanent marker. She was recording again, trying to prove something that didn't exist. Naira's gaze locked onto it instantly. Her body tensed, feathers flattening. I could tell she was calculating the distance, reading the movement like prey. Before I could react, she launched herself upward with a screech. The drone jerked sideways, but it was too late. The Falcon struck with precision, talons scraping the plastic casing. The drone spiraled out of control and crashed into the grass with a sharp crack. Naira landed beside it, proud and unbothered, while the broken machine smoked quietly. I knew it was going to escalate now. Karen had been humiliated once by fear, and now by failure. And people like her didn't back down. They doubled down. That evening, I saw her standing at the edge of her driveway, watching my house. Her expression was unreadable, somewhere between anger and determination. The next morning, another notice arrived. This time, it wasn't a hearing, it was a violation. According to the HOA, I had willfully destroyed private property. Karen had filed a formal complaint claiming that my Falcon had attacked her drone unprovoked. She even attached photos of the wreckage as evidence. It didn't matter that she had been the one trespassing with her camera. The HOA didn't care about fairness. They cared about order. And now, they had decided that I was the problem. But Karen had made one mistake. She thought she could win by bending the rules. She didn't realize that I had been documenting everything too. Every incident, every intrusion, every false report. If she wanted a war, I was ready to give her one. Because this wasn't about a Falcon anymore. It was about control. And the next time she tried to take it, the whole neighborhood would see exactly who she really was. The morning after the drone incident, the neighborhood felt different. Quieter, heavier. It was the kind of silence that hides tension underneath, when everyone knows something's happening, but no one dares to speak about it. Karen had made her move, and the HOA was following through. By noon, another letter arrived, this time delivered by hand. "Final warning before escalation," it read in bold print. The document accused me of allowing an unrestrained animal to destroy private property and creating an unsafe environment for residents. They demanded that I remove or relocate the bird within 10 days or face legal consequences under HOA bylaws. It was laughable, really. They had no jurisdiction over wildlife permits or state licensing, yet they acted as if they ran the entire county. But behind that letter, I could feel Karen's fingerprints, her pushy tone disguised in formal language, her personal vendetta dressed up as community concern. I wasn't going anywhere, and neither was Naira. Still, I decided to stay cautious. The less visible we were, the less fuel Karen had. Naira stayed in her enclosure, restless but obedient. I spent evenings reviewing footage from my cameras, saving every clip of Karen's trespassing, every drone flight, every moment she crossed the line. I was building a quiet defense, but Karen wasn't one to let things cool off. 3 days later, something strange happened. Around sunset, I noticed a group of neighbors gathered outside my driveway, murmuring and pointing toward my property. I stepped out expecting another HOA pamphlet or complaint notice, but instead I found a hand-painted sign staked into my front lawn. It read, "Danger, aggressive predator on property, keep children away." The paint was still wet. For a long moment I just stood there, watching the red letters drip. Across the street, Karen stood beside her mailbox, pretending to check her mail, but watching me carefully. The satisfaction on her face was unmistakable. I pulled the sign out of the ground, threw it aside, and walked back inside. But by then, the damage was done. Word spread fast in neighborhoods like this. Within a day, 2 families had stopped letting their kids ride bikes past my house. One neighbor even emailed me out of concern, asking if Naira was properly secured. Karen had started a campaign, a slow whispering rumor mill designed to isolate me. That evening, as the sky turned orange and gold, I sat by the window with Naira perched beside me. She ruffled her feathers, eyes sharp, head tilting toward the open sky. There was something grounding about her calm presence. She didn't understand the chaos humans created. To her, the world was simple: territory, trust, and instinct. But while I watched the sunset, Karen was busy working on her next strike. It came the following morning, disguised as another safety inspection. A white SUV with the HOA logo pulled up in front of my house, and out stepped Mark, the same board member who'd questioned my consideration for others. He was holding a clipboard and wearing that forced smile people use before delivering bad news. According to him, the board had received several new complaints, claiming my Falcon was being neglected. He wanted to inspect the enclosure, citing animal welfare concerns. I let him look, knowing he wouldn't find anything. The pen was clean, spacious, and well-maintained. Naira stood proudly on her perch, watching him with icy curiosity. Mark's confidence faded as he realized there was no evidence of mistreatment, only meticulous care. Still, he jotted down a few notes on his clipboard, probably to make the visit seem worthwhile. Before he left, he muttered something about cooperation being appreciated. I knew that tone. He was just a messenger, delivering Karen's pressure. That night, I reviewed more footage, searching for anything unusual, and that's when I saw it. At 2:37 a.m., my backyard camera caught movement. A figure slipped through the gate, flashlight beams sweeping across the grass. They moved quietly, but not quietly enough. It was Karen. She crept toward Naira's enclosure, phone in hand, recording through the wire fencing. At one point, she even threw something inside, a small piece of raw meat. Naira didn't touch it, but the act itself said everything. She wasn't just trying to frame me now. She was baiting a reaction, maybe even hoping the bird would lash out so she could film it. I saved the footage immediately. The next morning, I walked straight to the HOA office. Linda looked startled to see me, but I laid my phone on the desk and hit play. Karen's nighttime trespass filled the small office, her flashlight beam dancing across the screen. For once, Linda didn't have her usual composure. Her jaw tightened. She watched the whole thing in silence, then leaned back in her chair. "This is concerning," she said slowly. "But let me handle this internally." I didn't trust her to handle anything. Still, I let her pretend she was in charge. By the next day, the neighborhood was buzzing again. Karen had caught wind that she'd been exposed, and she wasn't taking it well. Her blinds were drawn, but I could see her pacing behind them, phone pressed to her ear. The HOA was fracturing from the inside, some members defending her, others tired of her constant drama. Then, almost as if to reclaim control, she tried one last stunt. That weekend, she hosted a community safety meeting on her front lawn. She printed flyers warning about predatory animals in residential zones, claiming to be educating neighbors on how to protect their pets. About a dozen people showed up, some curious, others just there for the gossip. I stayed inside, watching from my window. Karen spoke with conviction, gesturing toward my property like she was pointing out a crime scene. She was in her element again, loud, dramatic, and convinced of her own moral authority. But as she talked, something unexpected happened. Naira, restless from being grounded for so long, had slipped out through the open side gate I'd forgotten to latch after refilling her water basin. I didn't notice until it was too late. She rose silently into the air, wings slicing through the breeze. Her silhouette glided over the rooftops, and when she reached the crowd gathered at Karen's lawn, she let out a piercing cry that echoed through the street. The reaction was instant. People gasped and ducked, covering their heads. Karen froze mid-sentence, her face twisting in terror as Naira swooped low, close enough for the wind from her wings to ruffle Karen's hair. Naira pulled up smoothly, circling once above before landing on the fence post at the edge of my yard. She didn't attack, didn't even touch anyone. She simply perched there, regal and silent, as if claiming her place. The crowd stood in stunned silence. Then, slowly, people began to laugh, nervous at first, then genuine. They realized what had happened wasn't an attack. It was nature being nature. The more they laughed, the redder Karen's face became. She stammered something about wild threats, but no one seemed to believe her anymore. By the end of the day, the whispers had turned. Now, instead of calling me reckless, the neighbors were talking about how majestic the Falcon was, how Karen had overreacted, how maybe the whole thing had gone too far. Her authority had cracked. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. People like Karen didn't surrender. They regrouped. That night, her lights stayed on until dawn. I could see her pacing again, blinds shifting slightly as she peeked out toward my yard. She was planning something, and I could almost feel the weight of her next move forming in the dark. And though Naira slept peacefully on her perch, I couldn't shake the feeling that the real storm hadn't even started yet. Because for Karen, humiliation wasn't an ending. It was motivation. After the safety meeting fiasco, the neighborhood slowly began to shift. The same people who used to whisper in agreement with Karen now avoided her entirely. Conversations on the street grew cautious whenever she walked by. Parents who once crossed the street to avoid my house now waved politely from a distance. The balance had changed, but Karen wasn't built to accept defeat. For the next week, she disappeared from sight. No porch monitoring, no angry phone calls to the HOA, no new letters. It was almost eerie, the calm before something big. I should have known she was planning her final move. It started on a Thursday morning. A white van with county markings pulled up in front of my house. Two men in khaki uniforms stepped out, clipboards in hand. They introduced themselves as animal control officers responding to a formal complaint of illegal wildlife possession. Karen had escalated to the state level. They asked to see the bird, the enclosure, and all related permits. Luckily, I was ready. I led them to the backyard where Naira stood tall and calm, feathers shimmering under the sunlight. Her enclosure was spotless, every regulation met down to the last detail. I handed them copies of my state-issued falconry license, training documentation, and inspection records. One officer nodded approvingly. "Everything looks in order," he said, almost relieved. "We've been getting a lot of calls from your neighbor. She seems very concerned." I could tell they'd been warned about her. They spent another few minutes taking photos and checking off boxes, but there was nothing for them to find. When they left, I caught sight of Karen watching from her upstairs window, her face pressed to the glass. That small victory felt good, but I knew it wouldn't stop her. That evening, I found a new letter in my mailbox, anonymous, but obviously her doing. It was written in all caps, demanding that I stop endangering the community and take that monster back to the wild. It ended with, "The HOA will not protect you forever." It was the tone that caught me, not just anger, but desperation. She was unraveling. 2 nights later, the unraveling turned into chaos. At around midnight, my motion sensor lights flicked on. I checked the monitor and froze. There she was, Karen again in my backyard. Only this time she wasn't holding a phone. She was holding a broom. She had climbed over the fence and was waving the broom wildly at Naira's enclosure, shouting something I couldn't hear through the security feed. Her movements were frantic, unhinged. Naira, startled from sleep, let out a screech that cut through the quiet night. I stepped outside just in time to see Karen swinging the broom against the fence, trying to shoo Nira away. The bird puffed up, wings spreading wide in a defensive display. She didn't attack, but her presence was enough to send Karen stumbling backward. The moment Karen saw me, her expression shifted from rage to realization. She'd been caught. She tried to flee, but her foot caught on the garden hose near the gate. She went down hard, landing in the grass. I called the police before she could climb up again. When they arrived, she was still shouting about danger, about wild animals, about her right to protect her neighborhood. The officers listened patiently while I showed them the camera footage. The same story repeated, her trespassing, her vandalizing, her harassment. This time, there was no denying it. They escorted her back to her property with a stern warning, but the damage was already done, to her reputation more than anything else. By morning, everyone knew. Word spread fast. Karen had broken into my yard in the middle of the night to attack a falcon. Parents who used to nod politely now crossed the street to avoid her. The HOA held an emergency meeting, not to discipline me but to address a violation of conduct by a board member. Linda, always careful with her tone, tried to soften it during the meeting. She described Karen's behavior as erratic and unbecoming of a representative. But the neighbors were no longer protecting her image. They'd seen enough. They wanted her gone. By vote, she was removed from the board that same evening. The sight of her storming out of the clubhouse, clutching her folder of complaints like it was a shield, was almost surreal. The Queen of Rules dethroned by her own obsession. For a few days after that, she vanished again. No lights, no movement, no car in the driveway. Some said she'd gone to stay with her sister in another town. Others said she was taking time to recover. No one really cared to find out. The neighborhood finally exhaled. Without her constant interference, the tension melted away. The HOA even issued a written apology, admitting that their previous handling of complaints had been based on misinformation. It was as close to an admission of guilt as they'd ever make. As for Nira, she was finally free again. That weekend, I took her back out to the open field, the same one where it had all started. The morning was still, the air crisp and golden. When I removed her hood, she blinked at the horizon, feathers catching the light. Then, with a powerful leap, she took to the air. She soared higher and higher until she was nothing but a dark silhouette against the sun. Watching her glide that morning felt different, like a chapter closing. All the noise, all the hostility, all the human chaos below her, it didn't matter up there. The next few weeks passed quietly. The lawns looked greener, the air lighter. Even the HOA emails got shorter and less condescending. The neighborhood finally felt like a place people could live in peace. But one morning I found something strange on my porch. A plain white envelope. No name, no return address. Inside was a single note, handwritten in shaky script. You think this is over, but nature turns on everyone eventually. There was no signature, but I didn't need one. The handwriting was unmistakable. For a long while, I just stood there staring at the note. Then I folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer with all the others, the letters, the violations, the warnings. A collection of reminders that control, once lost, doesn't disappear quietly. Later that day, I stood in my yard as Nira perched nearby. She looked toward the sky, restless again. I followed her gaze. The air was calm, the world wide open. Karen's note didn't scare me. If anything, it reminded me of the truth that had started this whole mess. The sky doesn't belong to anyone. Not to HOAs, not to rules, and certainly not to people who shout at birds. As Nira took flight once more, I felt something close to peace. She rose higher, her wings steady, cutting through the sunlight with effortless grace. And somewhere, behind a closed curtain or miles away in another town, I like to imagine Karen watching that same sky, still seething at the one thing she could never control. The sky had always been mine. But freedom belonged to Nira.